Yes. Hello, welcome everyone. Great to be back here again after, actually I've been here in 2020, the last conference from these guys before the pandemic, so happy you're all back. Today's talk will be about Kiling BFFs with Next.js. And I will also be using GraphQL, so if you're interested about GraphQL, there's lots of things to share today. So what is this talk actually about? I often like to think that companies, as soon as they start scaling, they have different type of clients. So you maybe have a web client, you maybe have a mobile client, and you maybe have some block of services. These can be microservices or a monolith, and sometimes you even need extra application layers in order to make sure the correct data will end up at your clients. So some companies try to use something called a backend for frontend, or a BFF, and in this talk I'll be showing how you can get rid of these BFFs by using GraphQL. And I'll be discussing multiple ways to do so, but the most important manner in doing so is by using Next.js. So I always like to think of these memes from SpongeBob as something kind of funny, but imagine it's actually quite actual, this one, because a BFF is something that has knowledge about a specific front end, but it has no knowledge about other front ends or other clients or other services. So actually it's quite appeal, like a BFF only knows things for one specific client. And this is something to keep in mind when we're looking at different patterns. So a little bit about myself. As Gertald already told, I'm working on developer experience at StepSen, which is a GraphQL as a service company. So imagine getting an instant GraphQL API based on any data source, whether it's a database or REST API. You can do it with this product. And besides that, I write books. And as React 18 has just landed, there will be a book about React 18 quite soon as well. So make sure to hit me up on Twitter at @GetHackTeam. And besides that, I like to speak at conferences. And I'm also really happy to see a lot of friends I made last weekend at City Jazz in London here and see them here as well. So glad to be back at conferences in general. So how did we got to BFFs? So backend for frontends is quite an old pattern. I think it started appearing as soon as people started making websites that needed to interact with APIs. And at some point you will have maybe multiple APIs or multiple websites. So BFFs are a useful pattern. I think the first start of this is actually monoliths. So imagine you have one big monolith API that is consumed by all your different clients. And at some point you will get into issues where maybe the monolith doesn't have the correct data for your clients, or maybe your clients want to do more with the data the monolith provides. But as your monolith is interacting with multiple clients, you cannot change API endpoints or fields or the JSON blobs that you return. So in that scenario, monoliths actually aren't the best solution for every front end. And I always like to think a monolith is one API to rule them all. So everywhere in your client, you'll use the same API, which can lead to different problems. And also microservices. As soon as people started using multiple clients with microservices, you will probably have one API gateway that brings together all these different services. This API gateway probably isn't able to help all your different clients with getting data in the right way that they will like to have it. And usually I'm not really a fan of microservices. I will share why later. But if your company starts implementing microservices, make sure to ask the right questions. Do we really need microservices? Do we have decentralized teams? And not decentralized teams on the blockchain, but teams that are acting independently of each other. If you're having independent teams, then microservices are right. If you have just a couple of teams, make sure not to use microservices just yet. So what are BFFs good for? And for this, I made a diagram. So BFFs are actually useful for a solution where you have multiple clients. And these multiple clients can be for the web, it can be a mobile client. So what I often see is companies using the same API for both their admin dashboard. So imagine you have a CMS or you have some sort of dashboard in which your customers or maybe your employees are changing things on the website. If you're using the same API for the thing your actual customers see and the things your employees are using to change data, I think that's often an anti-pattern. So BFFs are especially useful when you have one API and you want to serve multiple clients. So this doesn't necessarily have to be different devices. And this is due because it's very different in experience. Your web UI or your mobile UI, they have different UIs. They are behaving in a different way, and often they're also serving different use cases. So let's go back to that admin dashboard. It probably has a different use case with the data than the front end the customers are seeing has. And the same you could say for mobile. And mobile, often the screen is a lot smaller, so it is also a different experience. And also separation of concerns, because if we go back to the admin dashboard, you don't want people to use the same sort of APIs or with the same permission set in order to change things for your website. So there's the separation of concerns, meaning you only want API endpoints that are actually used by a client. And BFFs are really useful for this, because with a BFF, you will take all the APIs you have or you might need, you will somehow normalize them or add different permission set on them, and then return them back to the client. So BFFs are really useful if you have these different experience with a different separation of concern. And also for autonomy. So imagine you have one API team working on your API, but you have multiple teams working on a front end. It doesn't make sense if all these teams need to interact with your API team. Instead, it's more useful for them if they have their own BFF, which they can alter in any way they like. So for autonomous teams that want separations of concerns and are building different user experience, a BFF is a perfect way to go. But more services also has a downside, as you can imagine. So you need to take more services up, you need to put more servers in the air, maybe you need to deploy them somewhere serverless, and also it's an extra service a team should care about. And also if different teams start interacting with the same service, you can imagine things get messy quite fast. And for this, I'd like to use Next.js. So Next.js is not only a framework to build web applications, it's also a framework that helps you to build APIs. And specifically backend for frontends. I don't think you should build your entire API infrastructure on something like Next.js, but it is very useful for the pattern of a BFF. So with Next.js, you have it's not really new, I think it has been for a year and a half, called API routes. And these API routes are accessible as any other API would be that you would deploy somewhere on a server. And the diagram we saw before, it will start to look something like this. So we still have our BFF, which we'll be using for our web client, or a mobile client might still have its own BFF, but the BFF is now integrated into your Next.js application, or more specific, into your front-end application. So your front-end team can actually change the API whenever they like, without needing additional information about how APIs work or how you actually deploy servers to the cloud. And the nice thing here is as well, as soon as you do deployments, you no longer have to make sure that you deploy both your API and your front-end. Instead, they're deployed together. So this will make it very much easier for most teams, at least, to try and interact with their APIs using their own backend for front-end that's now integrated into one application. And you would still have the same separation of concerns that we saw before, because your front-end team no longer has to maintain a BFF. Instead, they only maintain their own web framework. So for them, not much changes, besides they have less work on making sure different repositories are merged at the same time and different projects come together at the same form and shape. And they still have the autonomy, because this BFF is only used within their own application. And an anti-pattern you often see is one team makes a web BFF and then a different team tries to interact with it, which is definitely an anti-pattern, and by integrating with Next.js, it's way harder for those different teams to try and integrate with your own BFF. And most of all, which I like to say, is it's no additional overhead. So as mentioned before, you don't need extra knowledge about how to deploy a service that's based on an API. So instead of running your own Node.js service, or in what kind of language you like to build your API, you can now do this all from Next.js with the same sort of concepts and patterns as you are used to. And something I really like is you can also use GraphQL. And this is a pattern I also see at companies. You maybe have a backend team that doesn't like to implement GraphQL for their APIs. So instead, you can just take GraphQL and put it into a Next.js API route. So you no longer have to communicate with your backend team if you want to use a different protocol for your APIs. Instead, you can take matters into your own hand and start building a GraphQL API today. And this, it will also help you with tapping into the ecosystem. Because fetching API requests based on REST, you typically do it with something like Fetch or Axios, or maybe even React Query. But when you're using GraphQL, you get way more opportunities to use a different ecosystem, with caching around it, logging, but also an easier way to communicate state and data across different components. So let's look at a demo for this. So I built a project based on Next.js. It's not that fancy. It has multiple things in it. And the thing I'd like to show you first is an API route. So this is actually quite cool. So if you look at the file system of Next.js, typically when you create a new page in the pages directory, you will get a new page in your application as well. So instead of building a page that's maybe called posts or users or whatever you like to call it, you can now create a page called API. And if you create this into a subdirectory, you can have multiple API routes in there. And you can even nest them multiple ways, so you can create subdirectories inside API to do more complicated things. So what I'd like to show you here is that you actually have a API route which is called hello. So you would go to your application. If it's running on localhost, you would go to /pages, /API, /hello, and you will return John Doe. And you can take the same API route and actually deploy something else on it. Or not deploying, you can build something else in it, and as soon as you deploy your Next.js application, this API will also be deployed within the boundaries of Next.js, of course. So what I've done here, I've built a endpoint called GraphQL, because usually when you build a GraphQL server, you're going to use one endpoint which is called GraphQL. And on this you can often find a interactive playground to interact with your data, but you can also query it directly. So what I've done here, I've used a simple Express GraphQL framework, and there are many other libraries to help you with this, and most of the code is easily exchangeable with whatever GraphQL framework you like to use in your application. And what I've done next is actually build a schema. So this schema has some types in it. It has a user, it has a post, some other fields, and then it has one query to actually get post information. Because what I want to do with my client, I want to show information from the post endpoint, and I want to combine it with a different endpoint from my API. But as my API is using REST, I cannot merge these two endpoints individually. So I would need to either create a BFF for it that will fetch both endpoints and bring my data together in a form and shape that I want to use it in my client, or I can start using GraphQL. So by creating this GraphQL server with this schema and a couple of resolvers, to walk you quickly through it, so I've created a mock API that will get post information. This is just an array with some objects in there with some fields, and this will be returned for my query called post. But then for specific fields, I'm also getting different information. So as soon as you would call the author field, so when I have my post, I want to combine the data for my users, and the user that's linked to a post is typically the author of that post. So when I get my post, I also want to get the author for it, which is coming from a different endpoint. So in this GraphQL resolver, I'll make sure to merge these two together. So for my frontend application, or actually still the same application, I can query these at once. So instead of doing multiple requests from your client, you'll be doing multiple requests from your backend for frontend, or actually a Next.js API route. So you don't have to implement the backend for frontend pattern yourself. Instead, just use a Next.js API route. And this will all be merged together. I have some middleware in there in which you can do fancy things. So if suppose you maybe want to do some logging, you want to keep track of performance, because it can be an issue, of course, if you deploy an API within a web framework, make sure that the API is actually performant. Typically, it doesn't really matter because they're in the same instance. So if you would deploy this in one Docker, it would be one Docker container as well. And here you can do all the other fancy things. And I've actually used the Graphical Playground, which I can start by just starting up my application. And I would have a Graphical Playground here. Make sure to reload it. So this will do multiple things as soon as I refresh it and my server is started up. So for my frontend application, I can then use this server as soon as it's booted. Let's see if it does. No, it's not that fast, so beg you my pardon. I will share the GitHub link with you later while we wait for this thing to load. But the idea is here that this data for posts is coming from your post REST API endpoint. And then the data from author, which is the second one, is coming from a different REST API endpoint. And you merge the data together when you're your next API route. If we go back to the code, maybe restarting some things will help. Otherwise, I'll just continue by showing you the client integration on the front end. So if we would go to my main index page, you can see I've actually taken the main boilerplate that Next.js generates with some cards. I've added some information about GraphQL. I've added where to actually change the schema for this. And then I'm iterating over data. And this data is coming from the different API endpoints that my backend team created. And the fancy part actually is going on here in the function called getServerSideProps. If you're not familiar with Next.js, it makes it really easy to do server-side requests. So instead of doing everything from your client, you can do a server-side call, which is then also good for SEO or often also the performance of your website, which really depends on how you're using things. And then in here, I'm calling this query, which is the same one you saw on the playground, and then I'll make sure to return it as props to my component. So your component won't be visible until this data is being loaded, unless you're using different patterns in order to make sure the data is actually there before you start using it. I see this thing is actually loaded. And then I will go to my GraphQL endpoint to see which queries I've added. I have a query called posts. And then in here I should be able to run this somehow. But somehow it doesn't. Make sure this is a query. And there is my data. So this data comes from one endpoint that gets data from the REST API, and then this author field is actually coming from a different endpoint. And by merging these together, you will get access to both endpoints from just one query. So from a client-side perspective, not much has changed. A lot has changed actually, but from a backend perspective, not much has changed, because you don't need to make alterations to your backend. And here, an example can find out all the different fields I could query. So I would go to post. I can see there isn't much information for the post. I could maybe add a body or the ID. But then for author, a lot has changed, because there are a lot of different fields here. And this is also the advantage of using something like this, because on not all pages you want to show all this information about the user. You can see there's an address, there's a company, which is also nested data. So there's like a name for the company, a catchphrase, and there's also more information for the address. And all this information is something you don't want to show on every page. So imagine combining these two requests on the front end. You'll be loading lots of data into your application, and then you need to make sure you normalize it up there. So API routes will also give you some performance updates there. And then the way GraphQL works, you can also use data in a graph way. So you can use data iteratively, and you can also nest data that's coming from a top parent. So you can see you can get the post information. You can also get the author for it, but then you can even link the posts again. And this can go on and on and on. As you can see, you have author here, then you have post there again. So this is something you need to optimize for, because if you don't, and this will be a public API that's not linked to your front-end client, things will get messy and people will start asking a lot of information from your server. So if you would look at the GitHub API, an example, they have a REST API and a GraphQL API, and you can see they actually did way more limitations on the GraphQL API, because with this nested data field, it's quite easy to mess with your backends or maybe even the databases behind it. And as I mentioned, it will also give you a way to tap into the ecosystem. So in here, by just creating this GraphQL endpoint, I can use different tools that are popular within the GraphQL ecosystem. So I'm using here GraphQL request only, but you can add other libraries as well that will help you doing state management, will help you with caching, and also by making sure you look at data in an efficient way. And you can also add more props to it, like things for pagination and so forth. And by doing it this way, you no longer have to ask your backend team to implement pagination. Instead, you can implement it yourself. And then my front-end application should look something like this. It will just get all the data from my authors. And then whenever I want more data, it's quite easy, because the only thing you'll need to do is change the query you're using on this page. So if from the author, we maybe also want to get some automation information from there. You could go to the playground, see what data is available. So imagine here you can also get a website for it. We could go to our application here and we can request the website. And then the only thing you will need to do is implement the website here. So maybe this href could become the website I have for this user. And then of course it should be author.website. So this is a very easy way. You no longer have to introspect all the different REST API endpoints, and you can use the playground to consume and explore your own APIs. And then I always like to think, let's suppose you have multiple web clients. So maybe you still have this website that is user-facing or customer-facing. You have another website that's used by your employees in order to do maybe management of your users. As soon as you start using multiple BFFs, you can also look at building a GraphQL API yourself. And this GraphQL API can also take over all the capabilities that different BFFs have. So instead of having a BFF for your mobile client and your backend your admin dashboard, and also for your mobile client, you could have one big GraphQL server that's optimized for everything. Because as the fields are dynamic, you can optimize for multiple things at once. So maybe one application is requesting user information that includes an address, while another client doesn't. And it shouldn't impact any performance from your website, which is the major upside you will get here. And the nice thing also about building these API routes, it's quite easy to actually take the logic you've built inside an API route and turn it into a separate service. So what we've done on the API route by building the schema, defining types in there, then building the resolvers, and then making sure these things tie together into one GraphQL server. You can take this logic and just paste it in a new project, make sure you have a Node.js runtime running, and you can just deploy it anywhere. So it should be quite easy for most teams to take this logic and put it somewhere else. So this is often something I hear from people. They're afraid if they start implementing a BFFs, there's no way to go back, or there's no way to make it serve multiple front ends. By using an approach like this, it's quite easy to take the logic from one API route and turn it into a separate service. And then something people also don't like is actually transforming a REST API endpoint into GraphQL types. We've built a website called JSON to SDL, in which you can actually take a JSON response and then turn it instantly into a GraphQL schema design language. Because you can imagine if you start taking multiple REST API endpoints and you will need to type all these types from the REST API endpoints you have, it will be a lot of work. So it's the same for TypeScript. Try to auto-generate as much things as possible, because it will save you time and it will also make sure you don't run into nasty errors. Or of course, you can use a tool like StepSend to generate the GraphQL API for you, which is just as easy as using some custom directives in a GraphQL file, and then you're ready to go. So if you want to learn more, make sure to use the QA tool that we have called Vito, and ask me some questions. You can also use the Twitter, or I will be around for the rest of today. And Next.js, especially with the latest release of React 18, pretty soon you can use server components, which means you can also generate these server components with GraphQL. So you can make sure the data is both coming from an API route and also coming from something dynamically. And if you want to start building GraphQL servers, make sure to have a look at JSON to SDL, because it can really help you take JSON blobs and turn them into GraphQL schemas and GraphQL types. So that was it. Thanks a lot, and I this talk and also the rest of the talks for today. Thank you.